Rural Quebec really was started in 1970, as I mentioned, with Charlevoix. And there, my main interests were people and architecture, interiors, outside. I was never very much interested in landscape photography, though there are some wonderful landscapes in Quebec or, for that matter, anywhere. Somehow, landscape, like so-called virgin landscape, never really interested me because there were so many other photographers who did it much better than I did or I could have done. If a telephone wire crossed a beautiful landscape, then I might photograph it because then I can see the traces of man, which has to do with culture, with industrial development. So then I would photograph the landscape because as soon as humans arrive in nature, it starts to change. Whereas virgin landscape changes from season to season. And somehow that didn't interest me that much. In every photograph, the viewer adds as much to interpreting the photograph as I do when I make my framing, select the moment. So a photograph has a totally different look in, in, in the eye of a beholder. For instance, I did about 150 large format photographs along St. Catherine Street. And there was a bank building, another commercial building with signs. Some interesting photograph because of architecture and life on the street, cars. And I showed this photograph to somebody, and the only thing that he noticed was the Aston Martin sports car in the photograph. He couldn't care about the beautiful bank building with its classical columns or the signs of the store next door. It was the Aston Martin. So the eye of the beholder is important. And I think a photograph that has many interpretations depending on the viewer are the most interesting photographs because it's more complex. You can read different things in a certain image depending on the viewer. Intention of the photographer is also an interesting element, which in commercial photography is very important because you take the picture with an intent to please. It's very important to please the client. But when I take a photograph of a street scene, for instance, and my intention is to show two people crossing the street, there's a certain rapport between the two people, or a rapport between a sign and a person walking on the street. And when I develop the negative, my intention isn't there. It just didn't work out. But that's fine. There's something else in the photograph that wasn't my original intention, but still there is something. Well, when I moved to Montreal after Quebec City, which at that time was very provincial and very quiet, I enjoyed the hustle bustle of Montreal because I grew up in a large city. So I right away started photographing here because there was so much happening here. architecturally, in events. I photographed, for instance, many artistic events, openings, vernissages, and of course, artists were always interesting people. So that was one of my main photographic theme in the 60s. Then I started looking at architecture, which is depending on the section of the city or neighborhoods is very different. Walk down onto Saint Jacques or Notre Dame in the old city. Those are all bank buildings and very sometimes pompous, and church banks almost look sometimes like churches. But my favorite neighborhoods were out in the eastern side of part of the city, on the plateau, where the architecture was also very varied. There are sections on the plateau that were built when people moved up from the countryside and built sort of Normandy style Quebecois stone houses, which you can still see on the plateau. But then most of it was probably built in the 20s, 30s, triplexes, duplexes, brick or grey stone buildings. So all this architecture interested me very much. And the street life was also, and still is, exciting. So I was very much interested in the fabric of the streets of Montreal. In the late 70s, I started photographing St. Catherine Street with a large 4x5-inch camera on a tripod. And I photographed from extreme west to extreme east. Of course, not every building, but buildings that interested me. And I was very much interested in science, so all the photographs were taken with a sort of normal lens, showing the opposite side of the street, really concentrating on how signs were incorporated in the building, and also how the architects in a very ordinary commercial building made an effort to introduce a sort of a decorative element, and that interested me. So these photographs again became sort of interesting cultural documents, because many of them were demolished and new buildings went up, and the signs, of course, change constantly. So this was for me a very important project.